Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's ICTI CARE Leadership Series webinar focused on modern-day slavery risks in the toy supply chain. We're delighted today to be joined by over 130 registered attendees from across Europe, the Americas and Asia. So a very warm welcome to you wherever you're joining us from today, and we're really pleased to have you on the call. Modern-day slavery continues to make the headlines, and for very good reasons. According to the International Labour Organization estimates, forced labour in the private economy generates over 150 billion US dollars in illegal profits each year, with almost 21 million people currently working in some kind of forced labour. The vast majority of victims are exploited by businesses, with agriculture, construction, domestic labour and manufacturing amongst the sectors most at risk. Whilst the toy industry is less exposed to modern-day slavery than others, risks do still exist, especially as toy brands look to extend their supply chains beyond China into new countries such as India and Vietnam. At the same time, a raft of new legislation, global sustainability initiatives, and increased scrutiny from NGOs, consumers, investors, and the media all means that companies across all sectors, including toys, must now take a closer look at their supply chains. So today's webinar really is therefore designed to help you understand more about modern-day slavery risks and their implications for the toy industry. We'll start by outlining legislation on modern-day slavery and other initiatives driving action to tackle the issue. We're also going to explain how modern-day slavery risks manifest themselves in different toy manufacturing countries, how slavery risks can be interconnected with other supply chain risk issues, and we'll also highlight how cross-industry collaboration can scale up action to address these risks. Finally, we're going to leave you with some good practice steps and practical recommendations for your own supply chains. So speakers today include myself. I'm Mark Robertson, Director of Communications and Stakeholder Relations at ICTI CARE. I'm delighted to be joined as well by two expert speakers on modern-day slavery and supply chain risk. These are Sarah Kerrigan, who's Human Rights Global Content Lead at the Risk Maplecroft, and also Marianne Voss, Corporate Responsibility Consultant at the Voss Group. We aim to speak for around 40 minutes today, and then we're going to leave some time at the end for questions. Your microphones are muted, but you can ask a question at any point during our presentations using the text box on the right-hand side of your screens. And we'll aim to answer these questions at the end of the presentation. I should add as well that today's session is being recorded, and the recordings will be made available to you at the end of the session in case you or a colleague want to listen again. So just before we get started, a very kind of quick introduction to us. So ICTI CARE is the Ethical Supply Chain Certification and Capability Building Program for the global toy and entertainment industry. We work with thousands of toy brands, retailers, suppliers, and manufacturers around the world to drive ethical standards and deliver improvements in the toy industry supply chain. And really our core focus or mission is to deliver better lives for toy workers everywhere, and this underpins all that we do. We've been operating for over a decade, and we now work in 12 different countries globally, representing around about 700,000 workers worldwide. And whilst the majority of our programs focus on China, increasingly we're expanding beyond China and looking at other countries, particularly India and Vietnam. Okay, so getting started then. Defining modern-day slavery. So the 1930 International Labour Organization's Forced Labour Convention defines forced labour as all work or service which is exacted from any person under the menace of penalty and for which the said person has not offered themselves voluntarily. So that's quite a long-winded statement, but really, whilst modern-day slavery is technically illegal in almost every country on earth, it still exists in various forms today, almost everywhere. And from forced labour to bonded labour, human trafficking to child labour, new definitions have really continued to evolve to reflect the different slavery which exists today. And modern-day slavery really, therefore, has become an umbrella term which essentially describes situations when any person, adult or child, is coerced to work against their will. And although there are different forms of slavery or modern slavery, most include some element of forced labour. And these are situations where people are forced to work, possibly with no payment, through violence or intimidation. Migrant workers, both internal and international, are particularly vulnerable to forced labour. And in China, where roughly 94% of the world's toys are manufactured, the workforce is comprised of large quantities of domestic migrant workers. So really, domestic migrant workers are the issue here. And these are workers that have moved from rural communities to work in toy factories in southern China mainly. And the seasonal nature of toy manufacture creates unique challenges for the toy industry and for toy factories. And this can mean that in peak production seasons, such as where we are now, in summer, during the summer months, workforces can more than double in size during peak production months. So that creates unique pressures, which we'll talk on a little bit later in the webinar. So thinking really about what the drivers are, and really why is modern day slavery worthy of a discussion for us today? After all, these aren't new issues, and many of us on the call will no doubt have been working to prevent human rights violations from occurring within our supply chains for some time now. And I think the answer lies quite clearly in the last 12 months. Pretty many of you will have heard or read at least one article relating to investigations of allegations of slavery in the Thai fishing industry. Last July, for example, the US company Signal International was ordered to pay more than $14 million to trafficked workers and subsequently filed for bankruptcy. Meanwhile, the world's chocolate manufacturer is in court over allegations of child labour. And earlier this year, Amnesty International accused global smartphone companies around the world of ignoring child labour accusations in their supply chains. Alongside this, there's been a 152% increase in media coverage relating to modern-day slavery over the last 3 years as well. So, alongside public scrutiny and associated reputational risk, there's also more global commitment and leadership on modern-day slavery, with governments, NGOs, and civil society groups coming together to make the eradication of modern-day slavery a target. And this has been manifested particularly within the recently adopted Sustainable Development Goals. And these include targets to eradicate forced labour and end modern-day slavery and human trafficking. But it doesn't stop there. Importantly, governments are taking increasing and unprecedented steps to tackle human trafficking and modern-day slavery through new legislation and regulation. And really, all of this means that toy companies are now both legally and ethically required to do more to prevent human trafficking and modern-day slavery, even though the risks in certain manufacturing centres may be perceived to be relatively minor compared to others. So I'm now going to hand over to Sarah from Verisk Maplecroft, who's going to explain a bit more about how new and emerging legislation in the UK, US, and Europe is challenging traditional approaches to supply chain risks, specifically on modern-day slavery.
Thank you, Mark. So just to quickly introduce myself and also Verisk Maplecroft. So Verisk Maplecroft, we are a leading global risk analytics research and strategic forecasting company. And we've been working with multinational companies from a wide range of sectors over the past 10 years to help them deal with, manage, and mitigate a whole range of issues, including political, economic, environmental, and human rights. And within my role as a Human Rights Global Content Lead, I've been working with the organisation for 3 years now. And I really work very closely with the company, as well as our kind of partner organisations and clients to really address a wide range of human rights issues, including modern slavery, which is an issue which we've been tracking for a number of years now. So to move back to the webinar content and the slide in front of you on emerging legislation, what I really wanted to emphasize here with this slide is the growth of new and emerging legislation in the US and Europe, because what we're really seeing is a tightening of regulation of business supply chains. So if we look initially at the timeline in front of you, looking at 2011, this is the introduction of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which clearly states that governments have a responsibility to protect, businesses have a responsibility to respect, and both have a responsibility to remediate risk. And this really set the tone for kind of business best practice, and also sparked a whole series of voluntary reporting, not obligations, but kind of suggested practices or best practices. Now, over the following years, particularly over the last 5 years, what we have seen is a real development and strengthening of regulation, moving from voluntary reporting through to mandatory reporting. And one of the primary pieces of legislation which has come in under 2015 is the UK Modern Slavery Act. Now, this Slavery Act legally requires companies to publicly disclose the steps that they have taken to ensure that operations are free of slavery. And whilst the government doesn't prescribe the specifics of that law, it does require companies to report out on an annual basis their progression in tackling this issue. And notably, as you kind of look at the screen, you can see that the evolution and development of multiple laws from 2014 onwards. And I just wanted to draw your attention to the French bill on parent company liability, which is still currently pending in the French government. Now, this law is particularly significant because an original iteration of this law actually required or would have required businesses to detail their practices, their due diligence practices for not only their direct operations, but also for the first-tier suppliers in their value chain. So what this really emphasizes is a trend towards legal accountability for human rights violations, both within companies' direct operations, but increasingly in the supply chain. If you could.
Excellent. Thanks, Sarah. Thank you. So we're now going to just conduct a quick poll just to get a sense of where each of you are at on the call in terms of your approach to modern-day slavery. So hopefully on screen now you can see our poll question, which is, what are you currently doing to address modern-day slavery risks in your supply chain? So we've got, it's kind of a multiple choice question. You are able to select one or more than one issues answers, I should say. So I think people are now submitting their responses. So just give it a minute whilst they're coming in. Thick and fast, I can see, which is fantastic. Okay, interesting. So not all of us have published a statement on modern-day slavery risk, and I think that's not surprising, given the obligations under the UK Modern-Day Slavery Act specifically means that because of reporting cycles, companies aren't necessarily yet obligated to submit that. But interesting that 31% of us done already, of people on the call have done so already. Encouraging that, you know, over a third of callers have mapped suppliers, specifically on modern-day slavery risk, but clearly there's more scope to go further on that. A greater number have risk-assessed suppliers. It'd be interesting to see if there's questions in relation to that we might be able to help answer further along in the call. And 13% of you aren't doing anything yet. So hopefully this call will equip you and help you go further with your modern-day slavery approach. Excellent. Okay, so if we move on next to the next slide. So back to Sarah for an overview of risks at the country level.
Yeah, sure. So I wanted to take this opportunity to just walk through some of our data. So whilst Burris Maplecroft is actually producing a modern slavery index later on this year, what I have in front of you is our existing Burris Maplecroft Forced Labour Index 2016. And as Mark outlined very early on in the presentation, forced labour is actually a subcomponent of modern slavery. So looking at the map in front of you, what this really demonstrates is quite wide-ranging risk exposure for many companies. So the index, it assesses and analyzes 198 countries worldwide and categorizes risk on a 0 to 10 scale, with 0 being extreme risk and 10 being low risk. And what you can see here is, you know, large areas of extreme and high risk for many regions, particularly in the Southeast Asia region, which is obviously a priority sourcing location for many companies on the call. Looking here, we can see that China, for instance, presents extreme inherent risk of forced labour, as well as India, whereas conversely, countries such as Thailand and Vietnam present high risks of forced labour. And the issue of forced labour is actually heavily interlinked with the issue of decent working conditions. This is something that we found through our research. So looking at indicators of forced labour, we know, for instance, that low wages and excessive working time and late payment of wages, for instance, are key indicators. And from our research, we found that in China, for instance, forms of debt bondage have been identified, along with the withholding of wages, as well as late payment of wages. Conversely, in Vietnam, which is again a new and kind of emerging priority sourcing hub for the industry, we have seen issues relating to forced overtime and excessive working conditions reported both within the manufacturing sector as well as garment sector. Now, these industry kind of risks are heavily correlated with the seasonal nature of production and the fluctuation throughout the year. Conversely, looking at a country such as India, we can see that the drivers of modern slavery are actually pretty different. So from our forced labour index research, what we have found is actually high levels of poverty and underemployment are actually driving much of the risk in the country. And we found also that this risk is particularly pronounced in the agricultural industry. So this may be a concern for businesses sourcing raw materials such as wood, which may be used in the production of toys. Now, it's important to understand what is driving the risk in different countries, because the risk drivers should really show up in your audit assessment. So it's ensuring that you have clear audit questions that would enable you to capture this risk, as well as inform your remediation plans. Okay, if you can move to the next slide. Thank you. What I wanted to just highlight here is actually the breakdown of our methodology, just to give a bit of a clearer insight in terms of how we categorize and score this risk exposure. So at Maplecroft, we take an indicator-led approach, which enables us to systematically assess risks such as forced labour across 198 countries. And our analysis is made up of three key pillars: structure, process, and outcome. So structure indicators would look, for instance, at the domestic law, looking at gaps between that law against best practice, whether the country, for instance, has ratified key treaties on forced labour. Process is particularly interesting because under process what we look at is the government's efforts to really transform human rights, and we look specifically at the enforcement agencies and analyse issues, for instance, relating to the integrity of these enforcement agencies and corruption. And a key finding that we've found time and time again from our research is actually that in countries that have high levels of corruption, enforcement tends to be quite poor, which obviously exposes risks to the business. The final pillar, the outcome pillar, really focuses on the reported violations of forced labour. So, for instance, looking at working hours, lack of labour contracts, delayed payments. And in terms of the structure of these different pillars, we allot 15% to structure, 35% to process, and 50% to outcomes. So we really emphasise the outcomes, the reality on the ground in our final results.
Excellent. Thanks, Sarah. So now across to Marianne, who's going to talk us through how modern-day slavery risks are interconnected with other supply chain risk issues.
Thank you, Mark and Sarah. So what this particular slide does, and it builds quite nicely over Sarah's comments, when you're looking at what's driving risk exposure for companies in different countries, one thing that I thought might be interesting to demonstrate here is how very often the risk of forced labor and human trafficking and other aspects of modern-day slavery are often correlated with other risks in a particular country. This particular slide shows data provided by Thomson Reuters, which looks at their anti-corruption index score, their anti-money laundering risk, and the comprehensive risk score at a particular country, and plots it against their slavery index based on a range of data such as Walk Free Index and JT reports and others. And what it basically shows is that the more common the anti-corruption and bribery and the anti-money laundering risks are, the more severe the modern-day slavery situation. So there's two main points here. When looking at the countries on the right side, which includes China, the higher the scores, the higher the risk of slavery in the countries indicated. And the risk of slavery often one can conclude has a direct relationship with corruption and the overall comprehensive risk indices. So countries with high corruption and money laundering risks often have higher risks of slavery exposure for companies as well. Can you go to the next slide, please? So how does this really show up in practice, right? So on-the-ground research, risk assessments, and monitoring work in global supply chains routinely uncover situations where greasing the wheels of traffic and forced labor. Now, as Sarah and Mark somewhat indicated in their earlier comments, modern-day slavery risk for toys will often increase as you look at lower tiers in the supply chain, as you enter additional emerging markets for procurement and production. And given the high percentage of toy products with electronic components, I wanted to highlight a 2014 Verite report which focused on Malaysia. It demonstrates the vulnerability to forced labor as a prominent feature of the Malaysian electronics industry. In this case, the report found that a third of migrant workers in the industry are trapped in debt bondage and have their passports illegally withheld, as well as other risks of forced labor. So corruption may be present in every part of the value chain, from the first stages of securing the legal right to conduct business and location for production, to later stages that include the hiring of labor. Trafficked and forced labor intersects only part of a long corruptible chain of businesses. In this particular case, the corruption facilitated slavery in the identification, transportation, control, and delivery of individuals for labor, and then their maintenance of the conditions for exploitation. So why do I raise this? I think because it creates potential legal risks for companies under the extraterritorial anti-corruption statutes, such as the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or the UK Bribery Pact. Both those statutes hold multinationals liable for the acts of their foreign subsidiaries, franchises, joint venture entities, and even suppliers that use third-party employment agencies under a number of legal theories, including traditional agency principles. And the risk arises when corrupt payments result in direct or indirect benefit to an employer, an improper advantage through cheap migrant labor, or the avoidance of the upfront costs of employment. So attacking the present use of corruption in industry, whether in direct activities or by service providers, I think presents a unique opportunity in the fight against modern-day slavery. For those organizations, you know, the 47 who have risk-assessed supplier, but the other 53% who haven't, you may have other allies within your organization to look at your ethical sourcing principles. Many organizations, given the legal risks related to bribery under the FCPA or the UK Bribery Act, are already utilizing a risk-based approach for supplier third-party selection due to the regulatory pressures these statutes bring. Perhaps these programs can be extended to cover forced labor, human trafficking risks, or leveraged in your ethical sourcing programs. Your compliance departments will often provide additional resources or opportunities for collaboration. I think it's also important to think through this case study shows how a broader view of risks are necessary when you're looking at identifying and mitigating forced labor risks in your supply chain. Particularly when looking at remediation, there's a need to tackle broader causes, such as poverty, and not just symptoms of forced labor. Companies may need to look at addressing forced labor as part of a wider approach to improving working conditions aimed for continuous improvements within a local focus. And it may be necessary, given the complexity of these issues, the lack of visibility in your lower tiers, the lack of leverage, and all the other issues we've been talking about to date, to understand the extent and reasons for forced labor in your supply chain will likely need collaboration with community groups, NGOs, trade unions, and local governments as well. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Marianne. Sarah.
Thank you. So what I wanted to do now is just draw the attention, I think, to one priority region for the industry, which is Southeast Asia. So the Asian toy market is it's worth a huge amount. It's worth upwards of $25 billion US, and it accounts for an estimated 30% of toy sales worldwide, if not more. And southern China is currently the largest manufacturing cluster, accounting for over 70% of Christmas toys sold worldwide, and it hosts upwards of 3,000 enterprises, and has a 10 million strong workforce, many of whom are internal migrants from Western or inland provinces in China. However, one interesting observation that we have found for the toy industry is that rising production costs in China over the past decade have really prompted many manufacturers to consider moving to cheaper locations, both within China and elsewhere in Asia. And this is primarily attributed to the rising cost of labor in China. And what we have seen is countries such as Vietnam, which is now the second largest manufacturing hub, appear increasingly attractive as a low-cost manufacturing location. And this is really thanks to the abundant labor force in the country, as well as comparatively low wages compared to China. And however, what we have found is individual countries, such as Vietnam, present their own unique risks when it comes to modern slavery and forced labor. And manufacturers and retailers really need to understand how changing the supply location may impact their exposure to labor risks such as modern slavery. So the creation and growth of new manufacturing hubs, it does also offer the opportunity for manufacturers and brands and retailers to get it right, to take the learnings from the past experience working in countries in the region such as China and implement such best practice in countries such as Vietnam. And organizations such as ICTI CARE can really provide members with a lot of good practice and shared learning from their experience. And one thing that I wanted to really highlight is obviously with the movement of people around Southeast Asia is obviously the impact this has on migrant labor. So as noted, migrant labor is a key characteristic of just generally the labor force in China's manufacturing sector in terms of the internal migration, but it's also a strong characteristic of the region more broadly. So where increased investments in manufacturing hubs such as Vietnam have created new opportunities and new work, this will likely result in increased internal migration within Vietnam and perhaps even regional migration from neighboring countries as well. And it's important for businesses to really understand the unique challenges that migration brings because they are particularly that can be particularly challenging to tackle due to the complexity of migrant workers. And so what we have in front of you here is our migration life cycle. So what we've attempted to do is really map out the different labor life cycle stages and really highlight key points of exploitation within the labor supply chain. So identifying potential red flags for businesses if these items come up. So at the center, we have the 7 steps. And these 7 steps move through the labor life cycle, the migration life cycle, from recruitment through to certification, travel, accommodation, documentation, work, and leave. And correlated to each of these different 7 migration life cycle steps, we have points of potential exploitation. And just to highlight that these have really been included as an illustrative example of key points that may, key points of exploitation which may occur at each of the 7 stages. However, it may well be unlikely that all 7 kind of points and the full range of exploitation happens in one go. So just to walk you through stages 1 to 3, this is the recruitment, certification, and travel of workers. This moves from when workers learn about work opportunities, they apply for the necessary certifications and travel to the work site. And in this initial stage, indebtedness is the primary risk that may jeopardize workers' independence and render them more reliant on their recruiters and employers. And migrant workers are particularly vulnerable at this stage, as they may only have limited information about the employment opportunity in their local language, or they may incur higher travel costs to move to the correct location. Now, as we move into stages 4 and 5, it starts moving into where businesses have greater levels of oversight. So in these stages, which is accommodation and documentation, this is where workers may move into supplier-provided accommodation and receive and sign work documentation before beginning work. Now, during these processes, contract workers and migrant workers may be forced to pay excessive rent for substandard living conditions or fees for permits, and experience pressure to sign contracts with less favourable conditions than were originally advertised. Now, moving into stages 6 and 7, so work and leave, this is really where businesses can have the strongest level of influence to help protect worker rights. So once workers begin in the workplace, they may be pressured, for instance, to work overtime in unsafe conditions and without regular and timely payment of wages. Migrants whose freedom of movement is restricted and who may experience abuse or unfavourable working conditions may not have the same level of access to remedy or representation as some of their peers. Now, this is due to particularly the case for international migrants, that they may, being a worker in a host country, they may not have access to the same labour rights protections as their colleagues who are from that country originally. And this really does prevent them from identifying ways out, and this is where we address the kind of leave component. So as migrants hit the point where they want to kind of leave work, they want to change work, again, if their documentation is potentially held by the employer, this actually may move their freedom of movement, which is a key indicator of modern slavery. And so what this life cycle really demonstrates throughout all these stages from 1 to 7 are just key areas and key indicators or red flag risks of modern slavery, but also highlight where businesses potentially can have the greatest influence, which is predominantly, as noted, in the work stage. So this is ensuring that workers have, for instance, freedom of association and collective bargaining, that they have freedom of movement, they have their documentation. And we've seen some really interesting best practice, which will be discussed a little bit later, around how some companies are starting to deal with this issue of migrant workers and ethical recruitment.
Excellent. Thanks, Sarah. Mariam.
Hi, yes, thank you very much. So I think the issues we've discussed today show the necessity of collaboration, given that these are endemic issues that no company can tackle alone. And systemic and sustainable solutions may require, for sure, industry-wide solutions and perhaps cross-sector solutions as well. So one of the points that we'd like to end you guys with and businesses should think about is that toy brands and manufacturers should seek to actively engage with workers and suppliers that fall within direct sphere influence in order to address the risks of modern day slavery. And one example that might be interesting for you guys to think through is the EICC. The EICC is an example of industry approach. They are the Electronics Industry Coalition. They formed a task force against trafficked and forced labor to address further actions that they could take as an industry to effectively combat trafficked and forced labor across the industry supply chains. And in essence, what they seek to do is to change the norms of how business is done consistently. Some of the ways that EICC has been elevating the issue of forced labor include revising their code of conduct to reflect shifting market forces and the need for more proactive leadership on forced labor in their members' supply chains. This included a lot of things related to stages 6 and 7 that Sarah spoke about, looking and making sure that their code covered the explicit risks that prevent workers from quitting, such as document withholding, debts, or wage deductions. They've also looked at stages 1 through 3, looking at payment fees that look at deception and indebtedness, and they've moved the code to an employer must pay principle. They've provided risk assessment tools to member companies to assess and audit labor agencies that are among their top suppliers. And they are facilitating ongoing dialogue on trafficked and forced labor at EICC meetings and have held conferences between industry, government, and civil society groups in the US, Malaysia, and around the world. And they're exploring partnerships with stakeholders to develop new models to tackle structural issues in the labor broker system. One thing that might be interesting for you guys to know is in their code of conduct around combating exploitative recruitment practices, they shift to a principle where employers must pay all fees related to recruitment. They did carve out a specific exception around government levies that allowed it, and Malaysia, with the example that we gave beforehand, just increased the government levies that they're placing by almost threefold. So one of the things that may be interesting to think through as well as you're looking at what industry initiatives you could do collectively and with others is to look and think through with discussions with government, civil society, and other modern day slavery experts on what are the potential opportunities, strengths, and weaknesses and threats of the particular solutions that you do. At the end, however, external collaboration really is going to be critical for you guys to address the key weak points in a particular industry. Mark?
Thanks, Marianne, and we'll be concluding with a call to action around collaboration, to kind of further collaboration to tackle modern day slavery and other risk issues within the toy industry at the end of the webinar. So moving on, how does the ICTI CARE Program address modern day slavery? So for us, modern day slavery is a zero tolerance issue. That means that if direct evidence of forced labor or trafficked labor is found, a factory is immediately terminated from our program and loses its certificate. Our approach starts with educating toy buyers and training toy factories to increase their understanding of forced labor risks and modern day slavery risks. And our audits focus on toy factories in the ICTI CARE process to assess risks in relation to modern day slavery and forced labor. And whilst forced labor and human trafficking can be difficult to detect directly, there are a number of different factors which independently or in combination can increase the risk of forced labor in the global toy industry supply chain. And as we mentioned earlier, forced or bonded labor risks are really probably the most relevant to the toy industry. And those risks occur at each phase of the employment cycle, so from recruitment through to the actual employment part of that cycle through to departure. And what we got on the slide right now are just some of the key forced labor risk areas that our program focuses on. And it's not an exhaustive list, but I just wanted to pick out a few examples for discussion today. The full list, of course, is available on our website and can be downloaded from there. But for example, we really do focus on ensuring that toy factories and their direct subcontractors as well have firm and written policies concerning forced labor, bonded labor, and prison labor. We also check to ensure that there are adequately trained staff responsible for implementing these policies, and really ensuring that ethical recruitment practices such as voluntary hiring practices are adhered to, mindful of the fact that a lot of the risk issues present themselves at the recruitment phase, particularly around forced labor. We also focus on the use of employment brokers and agents. So all factories in our program must have a direct contract with workers and pay them directly. If an agent's used, then the relationship is not with an agent, it's with the worker directly, and the workers are paid directly. Our program also explicitly prohibits the payment of recruitment fees, so that's something that we do not allow within the program. Other risk indicators not on the slide relate to checking for things like record inconsistencies, which can be markers for modern day slavery, on issues such as absent data on worker demographics, wages, working hours data, and even quality issues, which can be markers of issues within the workforce. And of course, looking at things like ensuring that ID cards and wages are not withheld. But in addition to the issues we look at, worker voice we think really plays a vital role in identifying and tackling kind of forced labor risks. So alongside worker interviews, ICTI CARE's confidential worker helpline that we've been running for about 4 or 5 years now enables workers to flag concerns relating to forced labor and other supply chain risks to us directly. And our future plans really are to kind of build on this, increase the voice of the worker voice within our program as we look to kind of take those technologies further. But also, keeping workers informed of their basic working rights is also a key part of our program. And we do this in part by distributing care cards, which you can see on screen, to all factory workers in the ICTI CARE program. And these advise them of their basic rights in relation to forced labor issues and other risk issues, and promote the worker helpline. And we find the worker helpline is an initiative that we're very proud of. We've taken over 11,000 calls to date, and it really is helping raise awareness within our program and also at the factory level of risks which exist. So we've also recently strengthened our responsible recruitment guidance for toy factories. Last month, we published a recruitment practice briefing, which provides clear guidance and best practice on how to avoid recruitment pitfalls, particularly during peak production seasons, and avoid forced labour risks. You can see that on screen. Again, it's available on our website, both in Chinese and English, and it's actually been downloaded over 2,000 times in China alone since we launched it. So it's a good resource that's proving popular, and you'll get a copy of this as part of the handout that you'll get automatically under the webinar. So really, just in concluding before we move to questions, really we wanted just to leave you with some kind of key takeaways or next steps, if you like, for tackling modern-day slavery. So the obvious place to start really is supply chain mapping. This is the kind of critical first step to drive transparency and ensure that you know who your suppliers are and where the risks are. And of course, this is vital, because if you don't know who's supplying you, you've got no sense of where the risks are, or you really can't take the process forward. So supply chain mapping is key. It certainly forms a key part of our program. That leads on to an initial risk assessment. And really, this is about checking the compliance status of your suppliers. So ICTI CARE, that's about taking your suppliers through an initial kind of risk assessment stage, checking their certification status, and really kind of working up from there. Social compliance auditing is the next stage, and focusing specifically on high-risk suppliers and undergoing a social compliance audit. So again, for toys, that would more be focused on toy production in centres in Southeast Asia, which might be higher risk, and probably less so on supplies based in Europe and other centres where the risks tend to be lower. And then, of course, managing non-compliances. And really, this is about making sure you have the right corrective action plans in place to ensure that that factories have adequate policies and practices to prevent occurrences of modern-day slavery. And our program very much is focused on not just closing issues off and moving on. It's trying to make sure that the changes that we do focus on and encourage factories to implement are about longer-lasting change rather than just tackling issues on a one-off. And really, finally, engagement and capability building. So this is in part about engaging with factories to increase their awareness and understanding of modern-day slavery risks in your supply chain. But as legislation and regulation becomes more mature, there are new obligations to actually increase your own internal awareness of modern-day slavery risks within your own business. So, but not necessarily just within your own supply chain, but amongst within your own staff as well. So that's certainly an area which will continue, we think, to be a focus of legislation moving forward. And then finally, really just to leave you with some final next steps before we move on to Q&A. Firstly, review your modern-day slavery policy, approach and statements. And for ICTI CARE Committed Brand Plus members, we can certainly work with you to do that and provide support in helping you kind of draft and craft statements, particularly in response to UK Modern Day Slavery Act. Again, you'll be receiving more information on the Committed Brand Plus program in this call. We also invite you to sign up for a complimentary ICTI CARE toy supply chain assessment. So this is where we'll take your suppliers and put them through the initial part of our process to check the certification status and work from there in terms of modern day slavery supply chain risks and others. Also, really just building out from points that both Marianne and Sarah made earlier about the need for greater collaboration. We are establishing a modern day slavery working group, and this is open to toy brands, retailers, both toy specific and multi-category, and factories, really to look at new ways to bring the industry together and find new opportunities to scale up action on modern day slavery specifically. And again, at the end of the webinar, we'll send you more information on how you can participate in that. Great. So I can see if we move on to Q&A, we've got a good number of questions coming through, which is great. I'll just take a minute to get my head around some of those as they come through. So firstly, initially, the first question we have is how does ICTI CARE collect data at the industry level on modern day slavery risk and other issues? So the main difference in our program is the recent launch of ICPS, which is our new supply chain platform, and that's quite an exciting step forward for us because it's a new platform that enables auditors and factories to directly input information in relation to modern day slavery risks and other supply chain risks. And that basically ICPS connects buyers with suppliers. So it's a way of transferring and sharing information up and down the supply chain between buyers and suppliers, but also really about equipping the Committed Brands Plus members that use ICPS with more up-to-date and current information on modern day slavery risks. I think we've also got a question for Maplecroft. Just expand that. So the question for Maplecroft is, we believe the risk of modern day slavery to be relatively low in toys, but do you think there may be a greater risk lower down the supply chain in, for example, the use of home workers, or perhaps at the commodity level, such as wood, textile, or plastics, which go into toy manufacture? So, Sarah, I hope you caught that and whether or not you're able to respond.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting observation. It's also something, Mark, which you highlighted very early on in your kind of presentation around the relative or comparative risks for the toy industry. And I do think it's important for industries to assess where their risk lies, because this will directly impact how you work to address that risk. So looking primarily, I think, kind of at the manufacturing level, it's important. That's something that you can have kind of complete control over, or heavy or high levels of control over. So that would be kind of the initial starting point. But as you note, the risks may actually be further down the supply chain. So particularly when it comes to kind of outsourced or home labour, and that can be particularly challenging to tackle. So whilst it's very common to have a clause in a supplier code of conduct around the use of home workers or unauthorized outsourcing, it's actually quite hard to regulate and would require quite a lot of on-the-ground kind of discussion and kind of consultation with workers and with kind of factory owners as well. And at the commodity level, this is actually a really interesting area, particularly given the diverse range of commodities that enter into the toy supply chain. You know, anything from metals to wood to cotton. It's highly diverse. And the risks, they are there and they do feed through. And I think just one example just to highlight in terms of the growing expectation of businesses to be very kind of aware and up to date of the commodity risks. It's completely different industry, but looking, for instance, at Thai fisheries, this was a commodity that was found, so shrimp was found to have been produced using slave labor. And this commodity of shrimp found its way into numerous different products of major kind of retail brands. And so whilst those retail brands, were very far removed from the actual risk, they were ultimately kind of held accountable for it in kind of the consumer eye. So it is incredibly important to kind of detect where the risks are and how it's entering into your supply chain.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And a question here for Marianne. What's the difference between forced labour, modern day slavery, and human trafficking? So I think we've kind of covered this a bit already in the webinar, but if you're able just to perhaps talk us through a little bit more on that, Marianne, briefly, that'd be great.
Absolutely. So human trafficking, for all intents and purposes, requires the transfer of people from point A to point B. In most cases, that's sort of the traditional point that gets at the trafficking. However, it's important to note that some legal jurisdictions are now also allowing essentially in-country migration to fall within the definition, legal definition of human trafficking. Forced labor, as Mark said, is essentially a very complicated legal definition that boils down to one or two things. The entry into work, was there to a certain degree an instance where workers voluntarily entered into work, so were they deceived or somehow indebted during that process and then are able to quit when they want to. So forced labor can take many forms. It could be, bonded labor, indebted labor, contracted labor, etc. And then modern day slavery basically is a catch-all term for all of those things. So all human trafficking to a certain degree is a form of forced labor, but not all forced labor is a form of human trafficking, if that makes sense. Did that answer the question?
I think it does. Thanks, Marianne.
Okay.
A question for ICTI CARE. How does ICTI CARE work to address the particular vulnerabilities of migrant workers in China? So I think that very kind of element to this. So as I said really earlier, firstly, it starts with the initial kind of recruitment phase of the employment phase. So making sure that labor, really starting with labor brokers and agents, and making sure that workers are not, migrant workers in particular, are not exploited by agents or brokers. Again, as I said, that's in part about making sure that, well, prohibiting things like recruitment fees for sure, but also where labor agent, a factory uses labor brokers or agents, that they do that in the right way. So that's making, making sure the factory has a clear and written policy and contract with the agent. Also making sure that the agent that the factory then has a direct contract with the worker, employment contracts are made direct with workers, whether they're temporary, full-time workers, but also making sure that workers are paid directly and properly for the work that they do as well. But we've also got various other kind of tracks of work specifically to support migrant workers in the program. Where I've mentioned the care card and the helpline, which are there to equip migrant workers in particular who may be new to the workforce with information on their kind of rights and responsibilities, and providing information via the helpline. But we also recently have launched new kind of rural and urban integration resources for workers, migrant workers in particular. So these include a comic book, which is in Chinese, which we make widely available across the factories in our program, which includes all sorts of tips around how to adapt to factory life, and actually how to cope with city life when you've moved from a rural community into an industrial factory environment. We're also doing work to look at other issues linked to migrant labour in China. So we're about to embark on 2 pilot projects specifically set up to address left behind children in China. So the first of which will create child-friendly spaces in factories within our program. So that's all about reconnecting migrant worker parents with their children, which are often left behind when they move for work. So that will be the first phase of that work. We'll then be looking at setting up workshops and training to really enable and support parents, migrant worker parents, and help them kind of reconnect with their children who may be left behind. So that's about how do they have better conversations with their children on the phone, how do they reconnect with them when they go back to visit them in Chinese New Year, and really kind of equipping them with better skills to be better remote parents, really. And beyond that, we also look to make sure that certified factories address social insurance needs and payments for domestic migrant workers as well. So really, it's about looking at the changes we need to kind of audit for, if you like, and push for through the audit program. But we're also starting to kind of focus a bit more on moving beyond compliance and looking at other ways to particularly address those needs. Next question. So question here, sorry. Oh, right, yeah, sorry. So with question here, we've mentioned that ICTI CARE immediately excludes suppliers with zero tolerance issues on modern day slavery. Is this always in the best interest of workers? Surely walking away from a site with evidence of slavery is not supported for the worker. And I think we would agree. I mean, generally we focus and we only find indicators as modern day slavery and forced labour. So I think the first thing to mention is it isn't something that is perhaps at the #1 risk for the industry. Having said that, there are instances of forced labour, forced student labour, I should say, which we're coming across in China on an increased basis. And there, the kind of work that we've done is to engage factories to help them understand the issues around employing students, seasonally and good practice around that, but also engaging with academic institutions to ensure that students, when they do work in factories, are able to do so freely and not on the condition of, they're able to graduate, but not on the condition of them having worked in a factory. So that's one example where we're going a little bit beyond that. But I think where forced labour or trafficked labourers are found, then obviously a good response to that is making sure that we have the right remediation partners locally to support migrant workers. So just as we do with child labour issues, where we work with a local partner, CSR, to support any victims of child labour that we would come across, we would also look to work with a local partner to support any migrant workers that we would find within our program. So I think it's a good point. I think walking away isn't the answer, and it's about remediation as much as it is about detecting. Okay, time for one more. A question again for ICTI CARE. What role does the helpline play? So as I said, the helpline is a resource which we set up about 5 years ago. Since launch, we've had over 11,000 calls. And really the helpline is establishing itself as a kind of trusted, free resource which workers can really use to raise specific concerns at the factory level, which may be serious concerns or more day-to-day issues, but really it exists there as a resource for them to find out more about their roles, rights and responsibilities within factories. So a lot of the calls we get are often to do with quite day-to-day issues which workers encounter, such as perhaps wage payments or issues regarding grievance processes. Occasionally we do get workers raising other concerns, which we will then, depending on the level of severity of the issue, actually go and investigate at the factory level the next day. I think one of the advantages of the ICTI CARE program, and particularly with having teams on the ground in China, means that where serious issues are raised, we're able to get into factories at the factory level and look at issues, so we can be there within the same day or the next day if we need to. But increasingly, the helpline is actually establishing itself as a resource for factory owners as well. So each year we run a factory survey, and within that we ask factories specifically for feedback on the helpline. And actually what we're hearing more and more from factories is that the helpline is there as a useful resource to help them understand more about their supply chain, the issues which exist within factories, and actually helping them understand the kind of issues that workers are concerned about and how to tackle these. So I think we're still year 4 for the helpline, but it's certainly growing. What we're also finding as well is that we're receiving calls from workers even when they leave the toy industry supply chain. So as more and more people trust and use the helpline, we're receiving more and more calls from people who perhaps move into other industries but wish to kind of get advice. So my colleagues are waving at me saying that we've overrun. So I think we're gonna wrap it up here. So just to say thank you so much to our speakers today, to Sarah and Marianne, and of course thank you to everybody for listening in today and for your questions. I'm sorry I've not got through all of them, and we'll certainly look to respond to any questions that we haven't answered after today's webinar. I hope you can join us for our next webinar, which will be a detailed and in-depth introduction to the Committed Brands Plus program, and that's actually scheduled for the 24th of August. So a link to sign up to that next webinar will be available there. And thank you very much, and look forward to speaking to you again soon. Okay, thank you.